What an amazing community we have here. Special thanks to Chang and Quinn too for filling in at the last minute. Um, for some reason, they keep coming back here. I hear them singing. I think, man, they're so good. So, yeah, and Wayne for starting us off with the squirrels, which got me thinking about my own squirrels. Not that they're mine; I don't possess them. Um, I have these giant black walnut trees, huge. One is probably 300 years old, and when the walnuts start falling, the squirrels come out and they gather them up. But this is not just like peaceful, serene. No, it's a bit of a fight. I've got several different kinds of squirrels. I've got these big brown squirrels. I've got these black squirrels. I have these little red squirrels. A lot of squirrel diversity in Ada. And the little red ones, they're the meanest. And they like, as soon as one falls, they're like, pew, they come out of the tree. And if the black one or the brown one is nearby, they chase them away. And I went behind the tree the other day, and this this little red squirrel had been gathering walnuts, for several weeks now. And if I had to guess, I think he lives inside the tree. He or she lives inside the tree. And if I had to guess, outside of the tree near the hole were maybe 400 walnuts. And who knows how many were inside this particular tree. What are these beings doing, It's an interesting kind of consciousness because one of the claims of human consciousness is that we are the creatures who can see the future in some way. And we wouldn't say that necessarily of the squirrel, but there's a kind of consciousness there. There is, you could say, yes, it's instinct, but it is certainly rooted in the future. It's certainly rooted in a kind of imagining, even if it's not a conscious imagining, of what's coming. And the squirrels remind us of what's coming, which will be here tonight, apparently. And this is not just for West Michigan. We're talking about, after all, we're in a year where we're continuing to revolve around Terra, as the Earth does the sun, I suppose. What is our relationship to the world, to the Earth, to the seasons, to the rhythms, to the wind and the rain, and the forests, and the culture on which the culture that rests on the very foundations of the Earth itself. There would be no concrete buildings without the Earth itself and our relatedness to it. So, yeah. And what is it about this time of year where some of you, those who are joining us on Facebook perhaps, have fled the scene? That's not exactly an unnatural thing. I mean, you might say, oh, I'm tough. I live in Michigan. I don't need to go to Florida. But it's actually quite, the geese do it. They're like, we're out of here. So there's a, even within the birds, there's a kind of awareness that the seasons are turning, and there's a kind of cooperation with the earth. And there are loads and loads of myths and stories about this very thing. Some of them I'll talk about today. But the animals, I think, are the first, the first clues we get are from the birds and the trees as they begin, the beings, the trees, and we think about the bear. So Wayne also mentioned the bear that hibernates. By the way, there are caves that are 50,000 years old of bear skulls that have their femur bone put through the eye of the bear skull. These are ritual caves of some sort. Some sort of cultic bear worship existed in several places around the world. 50,000 years ago, human beings had a deep and religious relationship with the bear. Why? Oh, you could say because the footprint of the bear is a lot like the human. Have you ever seen one? A bear footprint and a human footprint? Look, they're side by side. They're similar. And here's this being that can walk on 2 legs, but mostly walks on 4 legs, and cares for their young in a certain kind of way. And anyway, so people have been relating to the bear itself. And of course, what does it do in the winter? What we all want to do in the winter. honestly. And the Native Americans saw the bear also as a kind of dreaming being, had kind of medicine in the dreams. Why would they think about it as being a dreaming being? Because what is it doing all winter? But dreaming up the earth, going to sleep and hibernating and emerging with something, with new life, you could say, with cubs. But also if you start to think more symbolically. So the winter and the seasons is not just like something to endure, but perhaps as a kind of gift, which is why I entitled my talk, Preparing to Go Underground, because that's what the beings of the earth are doing, and that is what we're doing in some respect, and that's what our psyches are wanting to do, whether we say yes to it or not. There's some shift that happens that's deeper than your education, your degree. What's in the unconscious and what's in the realm of the psyche is deeper. And it has its own pull and its own allurement. And a lot of that pull this time of year has to do with going underground. And let me say a few other things. Cultures cannot sustain themselves if they just put the pedal down and live in the blazing summer for 365 days of the year. You can't do it. You can't have an economy that only based on growth. It doesn't work. We actually know that it's like the most simple thing. Not everything can grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. What's going to happen? It's going to burn itself out. We know this, and some of the great stories, like think about the Icarus myth. So Icarus's father is a famous craftsman, and he says we need to flee the city, so he crafts for himself and his son, Icarus, wings made of feathers and wax. And the father, in his wisdom, because he's been around a while, says to his son, don't fly too low. The moisture of the ocean will soak into the feathers of your wings and you'll crash and you'll die in the ocean. He says, and don't fly too high because the sun will melt the wax. But the son can't hear his father really because he's so enthralled with flying higher and higher. It's like when the next generation has no respect for the previous generations. Imagine that. And they say, it doesn't matter, we're going to fly as high as we can. And they fly and they fly and they fly until they get too close to the sun and the sun melts the wax and they crash in the ocean and they drown. We need the old stories to whisper what we know is already true, but we don't really want to hear. Culture and life cannot be sustained by flying higher and higher and higher. It can't. It has to go underground. And if not, the sun will take care of that and burn up your wax and you'll die in the ocean. Okay? The myths were not gentle. Had a kind of shock to them. Or even think about the myth of Iron John that Robert Bly made so famous in his book entitled Iron John, which you should read if you haven't. But anyway, in the story of Iron John, I won't go through the whole thing because it's quite long, but the boy is taken away into the forest where he meets the wild man. And over the course of time, he discovers his own gold, starting with his finger, but then eventually his whole head turns golden, and he has these golden locks, and he has to wrap them up in this like headdress because really of the glory of his own gifts. What is this myth in part saying? It's saying that every human being has a kind of golden head that may or may not be discovered. Again, myths aren't like super popular. You can go through life and not discover your golden locks of hair. But if you do, you can't just live in the forest forever with your golden locks of hair. In fact, the wild man, Iron John, has to kick the boy out of the forest one day. And says, first of all, he didn't obey certain rules of the wild man. He says, all right, you're out of here. You got to go back to the city. And wrap up your hair. And if you need me, you can come to the edge of the forest and shout, Iron John, and I'll come and help you. But you got to go figure this out on your own. And he can't find a job. And he ends up working in the kitchen, moving the cinders, the ashes for the cooking. Which is, again, saying something similar. You can't live in the forest with golden hair all the time. You have to go down, whether that's into the bottom of the ocean where you drown, like in the Icarus myth, or at the very lowest position of society where you're simply moving ashes and cinders around. That's what the story of Cinderella is about. It's not about, oh, I get to meet a prince. You can't have such a thing without her first being cinder, ashes, kitchen work, low work. Society can't be sustained all up here. You have to learn the lessons of the underworld, of the underground, of the kitchen. Am I making sense? And what time of year most loudly communicates that? The time of year that we're in right now. When even the trees say enough is enough and they let go of their leaves. And the squirrels say, I'm going to get all 300 walnuts for myself. See you in the spring. So there's a sucking in of nature. By the way, I was thinking about this because I was listening to this TED talk, and the TED dude, or whether it's on TED Radio, I was interviewing a woman named Susan Cain who wrote a book called Quiet, okay, about introverts. Introvert and extrovert, the yin and the yang of culture, and perhaps of our own psyches. I know right now it's really popular to say I'm one or the other. I understand people they gain certain energies either from solitude or from the energetic relationship in a crowd or in a people. Call those people extroverts. But one of the things she says in this book, in Quiet, is that we live in a very extroverted world right now. And that's, she uses a particular phrase I wrote down. I didn't want to forget it. She says we live in a culture of personality. It used to be a culture of values where we would talk about character traits, and you would want your children to grow up and be honest and forthright and character traits, and that's what we praise. And we even, if you even read the language of the founding fathers and mothers, when they're talking about great people, they're often describing people of character. Well, we've lost that, obviously, and we live in a cult of personality kind of culture. And whoever has the most dynamic personality should be the leader, including Trump or Obama. He was a personality. Would you not agree? It doesn't mean he didn't have certain character traits, but we're comfortable. Well, that's very extroversion. That's very extroverted in its orientation. What's that book? Make Friends and Influence People, or How to something or other. I didn't read it, obviously. That's a very extroverted word, but that's very much what our culture is like, and it tends to worship at that altar, and now it's worked its way all the way down into the education system, and now I'm going to bitch about this, I'm sorry, but the classroom itself is set up for extroverts. And when I was a high school teacher, we had all these fancy companies who will remain unnamed, like Herman Miller, and and a few others. They would come in and they set up these model classrooms, and mine was one of them. And they had like 7 different pods, different learning pods, and I was supposed to not only teach but also kind of have some analysis about how the physical architecture was influencing the classroom. And there's a lot of truth to this, by the way. It's a very interesting field. But you know what they all had in common? They were 100% extrovert-oriented pods. And it's all about collaboration. Oh, and the progressives love collaboration. Oh, it's all about collaboration. Nobody can have an idea by themselves. We've got to collaborate, so we're going to sit in a pod. And what do the kids know happens? Actually, only one kid does the work, and the rest of them screw around. And see, only extroverts would come up with that. And in a culture run by extroverts, that you're going to say this is the latest and greatest. And think an introvert's going to come up with that? What if they came up with a classroom? It'd be like soundproof booths that you would sit in. You wouldn't see anyone. They'd like, this is perfect. What a perfect learning environment. So anyway, we need some correction along these lines. Now, what does that have to do with going underground? Well, just that. The quiet, the solitude, the snow-covered earth, the hovel of black walnuts, that's a much more introverted place. Going to sleep at night dreaming is a very solitary, lonely place. Going into the bear's cave to sleep until spring, that's not a party. That's not the disco, That's not, it's the opposite. And I think from a cultural point of view, we can say a culture that only lives and is designed around the extrovert will burn itself out like Icarus. We need to breathe and to go to sleep and to go underground and to be quiet. even if you're extra. And maybe it's a bit of a yin and a yang thing here. It's maybe the image that maybe is helpful to carry along some of these lines. I forgot to tell you, you need a pen. This is the second week in a row we're going to turn this right into a classroom. Although today will be a little more of an introverted classroom. You're welcome. You won't have to turn to anybody and say, what's your favorite deodorant or whatever. I hate icebreakers. It's just like torture. You'll need a pen. If you don't have a pen, you can use your phone, as long as you don't check Facebook. But I guess you can do that too. It's your world. And I'll give you some things to do in a minute. What other myths and stories did I want to mention? Oh, let's talk about Persephone. Persephone is one of my favorite myths. This is from the classical period in Greek mythology. But this is awesome. Who needs a pen? Who needs a pen? Raise your hand. Probably I'm going to forget to even use the pen by the end of this talk. So you'll just be like, why did we have a pen? Was that a metaphor for something? So Persephone in Greek mythology is rooted in much older stories. And in the great mother or mother goddess stories or the maiden stories of the Chalcolithic period and even the prehistoric period. And these stories are rooted in the shifting of culture from really hunter-gatherer to agrarian. And it wasn't like wasn't like a clean break. There was really, you had both the sort of hunter-gatherer and emerging agrarian societies sort of living side by side and sometimes mixed up together. But the great stories of the earth goddess are really agrarian stories. So anyway, the Persephone myth goes something like this. I won't tell the whole thing now. But first of all, Persephone is the daughter of Demeter. And Demeter was the goddess of agriculture and of the fruit of the vine, not the vine so much, that's Dionysus, but any fruit at all, harvest, grain, that's Demeter. And Demeter had a very beautiful daughter named Persephone. And one day Persephone was out culling flowers, picking flowers, as she liked to do. And she was out there with her friend, I don't remember who, I think maybe the daughter of the ocean, something or other. They're out there and they're picking flowers. And she sees an amazing flowering plant that had 100 flowers on it. And kind of in haste, she wants to try to gather them up. I mean, do you know the feeling like when you see something really beautiful, almost like a bit of greed emerges? Do you know, like, I don't mean, it's like a kind of clinginess, like, oh, this is so amazing. And that's what she's perhaps doing out in this field. It's a bit of Kent Dobson interpretation of the Persephone myth. But something like that takes over. But meanwhile, what she doesn't know, and what no one knows, is that Gaia, the earth, and Hades have cooked up a little plan to capture Persephone and take her to the underworld. And so as she's culling these flowers in this big, beautiful plant, the earth opens up and swallows her whole. And a chariot, driven by Hades, death itself, comes up and snatches her and brings her to the underworld. And only Demeter hears her cries at first. And by the way, a few pigs fall in as well. I don't know if I'll get to the importance of that detail. I'll just leave it there. A few little pigs fall in, which is interesting, as you well know. So anyway, she lives in the underground, and she's taken there. And Demeter falls into the deepest grief, the grief of the mother. A mother who has lost her daughter can grieve the way Demeter was grieving. And not only did it affect her, but it started to affect the entire earth. And she left the realm of the gods, Demeter did, and went down to earth and became a kitchen maid, essentially, and a nurse maid for a family. She was so deep in grief. But as a consequence of that, the earth no longer brought forth any plants or flowers or grain or all the gifts of Demeter, all the gifts of the agrarian way of life. She shut up the earth. And things started to get kind of bad because things were not coming back to life anymore and things were dying. And finally, Zeus even has had enough of all this and he wants to put an end to it. So through his negotiating powers, he negotiates or something with Hades, and Hades agrees, all right, I'll release Persephone. Even though they've now been married in the underworld, he says, I'll release Persephone. But what they didn't realize is that Persephone, as much as she despised the underground, also ate a single pomegranate seed from the underworld. So a little taste of the hidden beauty and seed of possibility that's only possible in the underworld she consumes. So she can't come back out totally. So they strike a deal, and they say Persephone can come out from the underworld for a third of the year. Or I'm sorry, other way around. She has to go into the underground for a third of the year. The rest of the time she can come out and celebrate with her friends. And now, when you were in school, they probably told you, oh, they made up this myth to describe the agricultural cycle, where you plant things in the ground and in the spring they emerge. Well, that's not untrue, but that's not just why myths exist. It also tells us something about the human psyche, that the human psyche needs contact with death, with the underworld, and with the hidden mysteries of what's below the surface, where dreams come from and imagination comes from and darkness comes from. It's a love affair with death itself and with Hades. We need a taste of that, even if it's only a third of who we are. Just like the extrovert, you can't go around, everything is a dance party all the time, okay? You'll just burn out. You need the underworld. A third of your life is tasting the mysteries of the underground labyrinth, so to speak. And this was an extremely popular religion or religious act, this worship of Demeter and Persephone and the cycles and the year. And a lot of it is wrapped up with mystery, what are called mystery cults, which is another fancy way of saying scholars don't know what went on, so they call it a mystery cult. And a lot of them were feminine in their origin. And I love in the Demeter, I'll give you two things. I'm getting really excited about this. One amazing thing is that in the worship of Persephone and Demeter, and along with, it gets mixed up with some other things, Korah is another name, there's some examples of women fasting for 9 days, representing these 9 days of grief of Demeter. Think about that. Not eating for 9 days. Not consuming and producing things for 9 days. And the women were a part of this secret cult, in a way. And at the end of some of these festivals, they would take a piece of grain and hold it up like this, which represented Persephone. That Persephone had gone into the ground and would emerge in the spring. Would have to go into the mysteries of the earth itself and emerge. And they said, this is Persephone. This is the embodiment, this piece of grain is the embodiment of Persephone, and therefore we can eat for another year. We'll dine at her table, and they did so in gratitude. Now, around this same time period, there developed another religion where a guy went into the underground around Easter and came back out, and in the Eucharist, what do they lift up? Grain, and they say, this is Christ. So, yeah, there's also that. What is that symbolizing? That's symbolizing, by the way, in just the most simple level, that you and I do not sustain ourselves. We are sustained by the mysteries of the earth itself, and grain, and the underworld, and something deeper than even what we can produce with our own hands. You know, wonder why Jesus says human beings do not live on bread alone. You know? Bread is what happens when we take that grain and we work it and we put it in the oven but on what is that resting? Something that human beings are not in control of. Have I made sense? So, human beings throughout most of history have found ways of saying yes to this life-death-life cycle of the earth itself. Of summer into fall, which is the time we're in now, and into the winter of descent and back out again. T.S. Eliot's poem is about that, where he's talking about, I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope. It's that season of waiting, of stillness, of anticipation, of the bear hibernating in the cave, of the deep wonder, will Persephone come back out of the underworld or not? And of course, to celebrate in our own cultural way, we have Black Friday. Think about that, though. I mean, the time of year that is about gratitude and really preparing for the descent itself of winter, we say pedal all the way down what can be as cheap as possible. And how can I, you know? It's a kind of anxiety. What if I didn't get the deal? You know, it's just like, maybe that's a bit like the squirrel. Actually, I just thought of that. It's like, that's what we're doing right now. So that didn't work at all, actually. Okay, I want to give you some questions. I want you to descend into your own imagination right now, and I want you to finish these sentences. Don't share them with your neighbor, that'd be too extroverted. Don't put them on Facebook later, okay? We're going on a tiny underworld journey here. And I'm going to invite you to use your imagination to go into the bear's cave, so to speak, to allow yourself to be snatched by Hades and taken down to the underworld itself. And here's the first question. Just write things that come to your mind without judgment. Here's the first little question. In quiet moments, I dream about... You finish the sentence. In quiet moments, I dream about... In quiet moments, I dream about... Here's another question along the same lines. The dream I have for the world is... The dream I have for the world... If that seems too broad, you can narrow it a bit and say the dream I have for my world, the one that I inhabit, is... The dream I have for the world is... Okay, one more. And this will use the seed as a metaphor. This pomegranate seed that Persephone ate in the underworld, or the seed of these black walnuts that um, greedy squirrel is taking. The seed. So here's the question. The seed I hope to nurture is. The seed I hope to nurture is what? The seed I hope to nurture is what? Protect your work. Don't let others see it. Don't workshop it after this. Yeah, so part of what I'm suggesting is that the earth itself and the great stories that are rooted in the cycles and even the great religious festivals, this time of year is very important. It's a time of preparation, preparing to go underground. And if you think about that just on the level of your own, the health of your own psyche, what might you be being pulled toward? You know, people say they have seasonal affective disorder. And I say, yeah, all things do. We're affected by the seasons. I'm not saying that's not a real thing, by the way. But I'm saying there's something also quite natural about that. The light changes. And we start to long for something like more sunlight. That's part of the natural flow of life itself. And so the question is, what, as we start to turn the corner tonight into winter, what underground cave might you be entering and inhabiting this winter season? I don't mean I won't see you, like, come back next week. I'm saying it's okay to come back next week. But mythically, what kind of cave might you be entered? And the cave is where dreams are born, where imagination is born. And yeah, those have to come back out to see the light of day. And then there's the time for how do my own ideas and visions and hopes start to mix and blend and interact alchemically with the people in my own family and life and community and world. But where are they born? Well, they're born in the underground, you know? Maybe this afternoon you might want to walk around and don't be surprised if the earth opens up and swallows you whole, taking you down somewhere. So in some ways I'm saying, how can we just, in a kind of spiritual sense, say yes to the time of year that we're in? And the underground journey is not like, it's not awesome times, okay? Remember, she's snatched by death, Persephone. Something quite ominous about the journey. You can't quite see beyond it. So I want to end with a poem here. And it's a poem about descending into sleep. I've read bits and pieces probably of this poem before here. It's a poem by David White called What to Remember When Waking. It's a poem about descending into sleep and into the imagination, into the cave and into the underworld in a way, and what you might want to remember upon waking. Okay, so I might throw in a few little Kent Dobson riffs, but mostly I'll just read the poem. In the first hardly noticed moment in which you wake, in that first hardly noticed moment in which you wake, coming back to life from the other, more secret, movable, and frighteningly honest world. In that first hardly noticed moment and when you wake, when you come back from that more secret, movable, and frighteningly honest world. Yes, he's talking about dreams, and yes, he's also talking about that underground labyrinth, which is frighteningly honest, where everything began. There is a small opening into the new day, which closes the moment you make your plans. What you can plan is too small for you to live. What you can plan is too small for you to live. What you can live wholeheartedly will make plans enough for the vitality hidden in your sleep. That's learning to trust a different kind of source than just, which is needed at times, the strategic mind. And then he says something quite lovely. To be human is to become visible. And even for Persephone to come into her fullness, she has to become visible, even if it's only for part of the year. To become human is to become visible. So you need to go underground, but then you make yourself known. To be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. The descent into the cave where you might discover things is what's carried back. The hiddenness in the underground labyrinth of the depth of your own being is carried out into the world. To be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. To remember the other world in this world. To remember the other world of dreams, or the underground, in this world, is to live your true inheritance. You are not a troubled guest on this earth. You are not a troubled guest on this earth. You are not an accident amidst other accidents. You were invited from another and greater night than from the one you have just emerged. Now, looking through the slanted light of the morning window toward the mountain presence of everything that can be, what urgency calls you to your one love? What urgency calls you to your one love? What shape waits in the seed of you? What shape waits in the seed of you to grow and spread its branches against a future sky? What shape waits in the seed of you to grow and spread its branches against a future sky? Still, there's some seed of you right now, David White is saying, that longs to spread its branches against a future sky. What you discover in the cave, in the hiddenness of the sleep, in the labyrinth of the underworld, is a seed that wants to spread its branches against the future sky. And then he asks some questions here. This will be my final questions. Is it waiting in the fertile sea? In the trees beyond the house? In the life you can imagine for yourself? In the open and lovely white page on the writing desk?